Before we continue with anything else, let's zoom in on one component here and let's talk a little bit about its various characteristics. So here I just told you that a component in React is just a function, and we are exporting that as the default from this file. So a function in JavaScript can be written in two ways. So we have the traditional function or the function declaration, but we also have arrow functions. So I could write the exact same like this. So we could also have a const called count, and I can assign an arrow function to there, right? And I can return the exact same. If I do it this way, we will get the same result. Now here, if I want to export it from this file with a variable like that or a constant like that, I cannot just do export default. So this is just not how it works with variables like that. So here what I have to do is I have to export it at the bottom here as the default if I want to have this as the default export as well. So this will work the exact same way. Now I like using the traditional function for my components and then the arrow functions for anything else. So if we have an event handler function, for example, or any other type of function, I will use the arrow function. But you can go anyway, right? So I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I will use the traditional function for components in this course. So I will just undo this. So here we created separate files for each component, right? So here we wanted a separate component for the count. I created a separate file for this, but you don't need to do that. So technically a component is just a function and we can have multiple functions in the same file, of course, right? So here maybe I want to create another component and I can say this is going to be count label, right? This will just say something like the current count. Maybe that's a paragraph. We can say the current count is colon, right? So this is a component. It's just a function, but we do write it with capital case, right? So that's one of the rules. If you want to have a component, you need to write it with capital case. And now I can actually use it here. So here, if we want to do something with that, so here we want to have a span, right? The actual number. And then on top of there, we want to have the count label, let's say. We run into an issue because I'm trying to return two things from here. And you cannot do that, right? So even in JavaScript, in a normal JavaScript function, you cannot return two things. You always have to return one thing. So typically what people will do is just create a div here and then put it in that div. Right, so here, if I can move it up and now save here, you can see I'm actually just returning one thing there, just a div, but in the div we have two other things, right? So now I have another component here, which is just returning this one element, right? So an element is just like an HTML. This is an element, right? And here we are not using HTML, we are using JSX. So that you could say it's a JSX element. And the entire thing here is a component, right? So this is an element. The div here is also an element. And here we have a component, right? So now we added another component. So our React tree of components now looks a bit different. So this count component now has a child component, right? So here we have another component now, the count label, right? So now this is our React tree of components. You can imagine over time, this will grow pretty big, right? So you don't have to create a new file for each new component, but typically that is what people do. So typically you would create a new file called countlabel.jsx and you would put it in that separate file. I will undo this for now because I just wanted to show you how that works with multiple components in the same file. So one of the benefits of splitting up our UI into components is that we can reuse these components multiple times. Right? So here in our app component right now, we have our count here, our count component, and here we have our button. So we are using each of these just once. But let's say in some other part of the app, I also want to show the current count. Well, I can just copy that. Right? I can just use it again. Right? If I do that, I now have another instance of this component here, right? And all of the styling and all of the logic that's related to that component will now also be present for that one. Right now it's just a simple span, but over time you may have a lot of styling, a lot of logic related to that component. And it's nice when you can just reuse that in multiple places in your app, right? So that's one of the big benefits of splitting up the UI into components. Another benefit is that it becomes easier to reason about your application, because if something goes wrong, maybe you click on the button and nothing is happening, well, you know where to look. You can go into that button file and find your button component and see what's going on there. Right? If everything was in one component here, it would be a huge chaotic component. Another benefit is that you can work on the count component and I can work on the button component. Right? So if you have a larger app, you may you may have different people working on different components, and it makes it easier to split up the work, right? So there are many benefits that come from splitting up the UI into separate components. Now here I'm writing it with the opening and closing tag, but that's not necessary. So in JSX, we'll talk more about that. You can also have a self-closing tag like this, because we don't have anything in between, right? So here for button as well, I can just write like this as well, right? Actually, this is more common. All right, now what we want to do here, of course, is that when we click on the button that we can actually increment this number. So how can we do that? Well, it's the same as with vanilla JavaScript. If you click on something, there is an event and you can hook into that event. So if we go into the button component, if we look here, how do we hook into that click event? Well, what you can do is on click. And then here we can specify a JavaScript function. Now, since we want to specify a JavaScript function here in JSX, we have to open up a window for JavaScript. You do it with 2 curly braces. And then here you can specify the function that you want to run. Right, so this is the event handler function that you run in response to that click event. Right, so here I like to use the arrow function. Right, so this is the function that we're going to run when that click event on the button occurs. And then in there we can have the statements that we want to run. Right, maybe I just want to log clicked. Right, so if I do this and now open up the browser console, inspect console, and sometimes you'll have errors from before, so sometimes you need to refresh for a clean slate. And now if I click on the plus button, you can see we are logging clicked in the console. Right, so that's how we can hook into events. So here I just have one simple statement in the event handler function, but technically you could have many statements here, and you can see it starts to clutter things up here. So typically, if you have more than a couple of lines, you want to put this in a separate function. So you're not going to define it in line here. You're going to extract this into a separate function. So here, what you can create is a function, and typically this is called handle, and then the name of the event. Well, here we would have handle click, and then you would put all of those statements in there, right? So here we can just put all of those statements. And then remember, this is just expecting some function that you want to run when the click event occurs. So we can also just specify the name here, right? So if we specify the name, what we're saying here is run a function called handle click when that event occurs, right? So here, if I now quickly show that again, that works. If I now refresh for a clean slate, now if I click here, you can see I get clicked 5 times. So I just refreshed for a clean slate. So I have nothing here yet. Now what happens if you do it the wrong way? So here what some people do is they execute the function immediately. If you do it this way, if I now save here and I refresh, you can see immediately we get clicked. And actually we get it more than 5 times because in development mode, React actually runs your component twice. We'll talk about that. But the thing here is you want to provide a reference to the function that you want to run. You don't want to execute the function right here and then. Right? So this is how you want to specify your event handler function. Right, so that's pretty common in a component that you want to hook into some event. So what else is common in components? Well, we also have so-called props. So let me remove this and this as well. So let's actually go to the count component. Let's see, we have count here. Here we are now specifying 0. So it's always 0. We are so-called hard coding 0 here. But what if we want to get a little bit more fancy? And we want to specify here in the app component what that count should be, what that number should be. So maybe when we use that count component, we want to specify what that number should be. So ideally what we could do is just specify something here, like what the actual number should be. Number is 5 perhaps. Right, so here, this is called a prop. And here, if you want to specify number, that's actually also something you need to specify in curly braces. And so then here we will be getting a number here. How do you accept that? Well, that's what's called props. So here you get an object here. So what React will do behind the scenes, it will create an object with all of the props that you're passing. So here there's only one. So there's going to be a number prop with a value of 5, right? And then here what we could also do is something else. Maybe some kind of limit. Has the limit been reached? True or false? I could say limit is a boolean true. And these are now the 2 props. So what React will do behind the scenes is create an object with number 5 and limit is true, right? This is a JavaScript object, and that's what we get here, right? So that props is that object. But then if you want to output that number here instead of 0, we can say we want to just output what we get here as props. So here you have to open up a window for JavaScript, and then you can say, well, I want to get props dot, well, number. right? So let me remove that, right? So now you can see instead of 0, we now see 5. So whatever I pass here as the number, if it's 3, if I save here, you can see it becomes 3, right? Because we will have a prop called number with a value of 3. That's what we get here as props. Well, it's an object with all the props. Well, we want specifically the number, and so this is what we get. I get a red squiggly line here because ESLint wants me to validate that I actually get the number as a prop here, but this is a task more suitable for TypeScript, so we will talk more about that later. I will ignore that for now. And now what we also get here is the limit. So limit is true. So what we can also do here is we can maybe do something with that. So if the limit is true, maybe we can do something else. So here we can have some additional logic here. Well, we can use the same curly braces here. We can say props.limit. If that is truthy, as it's called, we may want to say limit reached, right? And otherwise, we want to just show the number, right? Just playing around here. Right, so here you can see when I save now, we get limit reached because props.limit is true. So when the limit has been reached, we just want to say limit reached. Right, so now if I make this false, we should see the number again, false, and now we get the number 3. So here I'm using props.limit and props.number. It's a bit annoying to write out props.props. So what you can also do is do destructuring in JavaScript. So if you have props, if that's an object, you can destructure something from there. Right, so here, if you want to get the limit property and the number property, these are just properties on this object. That's why it's called a prop. Well, here we can say number and limit, right? So extract the number and limit from props. And then we can just use these variable names. Instead of writing props dot every time, we can just write limit and number. So if we do this, well, it will work the exact same, right? So here we have two props. One is called number, the other is called limit, and the values for them are 3 and false. Right, so we'll talk more about JavaScript and destructuring and things like that. Now, to take it one level further, what people do these days even is they do the destructuring immediately in here. So what you can also do is this destructuring, you can actually do it right here in the parameter list. You don't even need to do this anymore. So here I'm just immediately doing destructuring here. If I now save here, you can see it stays the exact same, so it all works. If I now change the number here to, let's say, 4, if I save here, you can see it becomes 4, right? So all of this is working as before, right? So don't worry, we'll practice with this. So we've seen props, we've seen event handlers. Those are very common. Now, what you're also often going to see in a component are so-called hooks. So a common one is the use state hook. So let me actually remove the props for now, because here we are passing in the number from the app component, but maybe we will keep track of the number in here. And let me remove this as well. But let's say we keep this number variable. And let's say we're going to use useState for that. And we'll talk much more about that. We'll talk about everything, just quickly demonstrating everything. So here we have a number and set number, and we're going to use the so-called useState hook from React. So I can import that, and I can also initialize this with a number. So initially it should be, let's say, the number 4. If I do this, you can see we see 4 here because 4 will be assigned to number, that's a variable. And that's what we're outputting here on the page, right? So this is also common in components. You're going to have some hook here, a useState hook. And basically we can use set number now to change that number. So maybe if we click this, if we actually click the number, not the button, but the number itself, maybe we want to increase it. Let's try. So on click, right? Because if there's a click, so meaning we want to hook into the click event, we want to run a function, right? So here you provide a function. And in there, what we can do is we can say set the number to, let's say, 5, right? So if I do this, what we're saying here, on click, set the number to 5. Now I'm going to click the number here, and you can see it becomes 5. Right, so these are the typical things you're going to see in a component. We deal with an event, we have a hook here, and a component can also have props. A component can be reused, so it can be instantiated multiple times. At the end of the day, it's just a JavaScript function. And you can use a traditional function like we're using here, or you can use an arrow function, right? So we'll talk much more about everything here. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you right now is when we create a new component, you can see it takes some time, right? So if I want to create a new component here, let's say example.jsx. So now if I want to create a component, I have to write out that function, right? So it's going to be export default. function example. Right, so it's a bit annoying to write this out, return, I don't know, maybe a div with example in there. Right, so it's a bit annoying to type that out. So I installed an extension here and I'm using this one. It's quite popular, as you can see. But there are other extensions as well that do this. But what they can do is, instead of writing this out every time you have to create a component, I can just type RFC, which means React Functional Components, because in the past we also had class components. These days it's all functional components. If I just press tab here, I just get a standard boilerplate here for a component. Right, so I don't have to type it out. Now by default, it also imports this React from React because, for example, if you want to use that useState hook, well, that's coming from React, right? So what you could write is react.useState, right? So let me write that for you again. Set number is number, right? So here, typically you want to use a hook, you want to use other React features. So that's why you already get this when you have like a boilerplate for a component, because it's so common. So you could do it like this. Now, I don't like using this like React dot every time. I think it looks cleaner if you just use useState like that. And then you do need to import it a bit differently. So instead of using import React from React, you would have useState like this. Right, so we'll talk more about imports and exports, but that's why when you use that snippet, you also get this import React from React, because sooner or later, because quite often you want to use those React features in your component, so typically you would need to import that anyway, or something like that anyway. Right, so we have event handlers, we have a hook here, this is the useState hook, there are other hooks as well, and we can also have props, which we can immediately destructure here. Instead of using React dot, I like to just use useState. And then when you click that number, let's say we want to set the number to some other number, maybe 5, right? So this is the typical anatomy of a component in React. All right, and actually let me remove this one because we already had a count component. Let's stick to this one.